So it's important to think of your elements like a pie chart, okay? So when you're designing a character, when you're designing a crest, what are your primary elements and what are the colors that really make up who that character is and what are the percentages of colors? And I do this even when I'm doing things like, when I'm clustering rocks, I don't cluster rocks the same size next to each other like this. No, when I'm clustering rocks in a painting, I'm going primary, secondary, tertiary. Ooh, mama, look at that one. Oh, I love that. A few more of these Zaun designs. This is where they actually like modeled it out. One of the artists was like, well, does that work in 3D? This is pretty cool to see, right? I don't think you can see that anywhere else online. Hello and welcome. My name is Trent. If you're new to the channel, I'm a concept artist. I've been working in video games for 20 plus years, currently running an indie game studio. I want to talk about how games are made. I want to tell you a little bit about some stuff that I worked on in the past. Today, I want to be focusing a little bit on these crests. These were crests that I created for League of Legends back in 2013. It's a little bit, let's just say, disheartening how many artists I see online claiming that they designed these. So I thought I should make a video showing you the actual work that went into designing every one of these crests. If you're a League of Legends player, you know these crests. I did these in my free time initially while I was still working on the Summoner's Rift redesign that they did back in 2013, 2014. I was a principal concept artist on the Summoner's Rift project, and I was helping out with UI, I was helping out with at the time it was called Bacon, but that ended up becoming Legends of Runeterra. I was helping out with some of the other projects that they had gotten started. And you might, reasonably, if you're a skilled painter, you might think, oh, well, I could probably render and design something like that within a day or two, right? Possibly. Some people a little longer, but I want to tell you, each one of these crests took 3 months to design and render. Now, how is that possible? Well, first of all, I'm going to walk you through the whole process of designing a crest, the logic behind it, the rationale behind it. This is going to be a long, meaty video. These crests were designed before they had designed the actual cities for these locations or any of the locations themselves. So there were different departments within Riot Games at the time. The VizDev, visual development team, would be coming up with concepts for locations. Like my buddy Mark Gibbons was designing a lot of stuff for Bilgewater. That was really his kind of dark piratey kind of thing, is his jam. So, there were some elements of what other artists on that team were doing that influenced some of the designs that I did for these crests, but they were so essential for defining things like shape language that's used in every character that's from, for instance, Freljord. They would use some of these same shapes in their armor and in their weaponry, and the vibe it has to be consistent and cohesive. And so it had to go through a lot of checks and balances. And so let's take it one step at a time and let's dig into each and every aspect of like what went into designing these from the beginning. And I'm just going to probably dig into a few of them because otherwise we'll be here all freaking day. So you'll notice that when we're looking at these crests, there is this sort of symbol, a very simplified symbol for each one of these factions. And this is, by the way, if you're designing your own world or you're creating your own universe, factions are a big part of that. What are the religions or what are the beliefs of different groups of people? That can sometimes write your story for you and create the conflicts between characters for you. But a lot of times, they want to break down, as designers, we want to break down the symbol of what they represent, of what that faction represents. And so the first thing we would do is try to find the symbol. What is the symbol of these people? And so the first image that I'm going to show you is exactly that. Now, before we knew what the factions were going to be, they were thinking in terms of like, what are the roles? So you might have like a tank or a mage. And so we began sketching out these sort of pie in the sky, blue sky ideas of like what represents a mage or a tank, for example, and we've got these like adjectives, tough, durable, disruptive. Now, like what are some visible, like visual things that represent those adjectives, that's what we would try to, like a shield or a giant hammer, for example, are great examples of something that you might think of when you're thinking of a tank, for example. And so, these initial sketches were that, as we were thinking about like a mage, what represents a mage, like a book of magic or a magical staff might be a good starting point for the symbology that represents your mage class. And then we might explore them like even simpler. The feedback I got at that point was like, just break it down into just like a silhouette symbol, and this is that symbol I was just showing you that we ended up on with the factions was like, just what's a black and white like stamp that you could put on something. And this is so key when you're like trying to figure out a complex idea and condense that down into something immediately recognizable. This is what the same thing, by the way, that I did when I was designing some of the faction crests for World of Warcraft when I worked at Blizzard before working at Riot. And so you'll see this same process carrying over, although they do things a little bit more efficiently. I never spent more than about 4 days on a crest for Blizzard, but Riot was like, well, no. We want to spend like 3 months on each one. And sometimes it was just inefficient, but sometimes it was because so many people had to have their say in things. And so we were, exploring these different classes really is what it was. So you had tank, mage, ranger, fighter, ranged class, like archers or thieves or that sort of a thing. Somebody that would, be getting distance shots. What's a fighter? What's the different like distinction between a fighter and a tank, for example? Like a little bit more agile, possibly. Support, something almost reminiscent of like medical. Like a healer. Assassin, something stealthy, cloak and dagger. Literally, like cloak, and you can see I went totally literal, and I went like, how about it's literally a cloak and a dagger? Like it was the perfect like symbol for what that could represent, and so we ended up like at that point, we were still refining these for a while, and we explored this idea of these different classes for a while, and we came up with some really interesting symbology, stuff that quite frankly could have been usable, in any one of these cases, and this would become the foundation for every one of those crests that we would build. But ultimately, and I think we did pursue a little bit further. We were still digging into the different classes here, more so than thinking about factions. We were going for like classes, and you can see just how many explorations. And I might do like a sheet this full in about 2 or 3 hours, maybe 2 hours. And then I would send them in, and then we ultimately ended up like picking different ones. So this would have been like our tank, and this would have been our ranged. We went with rifles, and then maybe this would have been the fighter class. And this one I actually got to render, and I'll show you that in a second. This would have been, our assassin type, and then, our healer type, so in our mage here, and these would have been fine, as like pretty high level renders of, that symbol that you would then pursue, to render or progress to render. But I think what happened is, and you can see here where we actually did go into like a first pass of rendering, and we didn't know like how detailed to make them or anything like that. We were still feeling it out and discovering, how much detail should we put into these sorts of things? How much rendering, how much line work? Should it feel really like smooth? And I actually thought this one turned out beautiful. Look at that. Like that's a really beautiful crest that just will never get used, will never be seen anywhere. It's not for anything. This just got thrown out. And that was true with a lot of stuff that I did for Riot, where we were exploring, and it's necessary sometimes to try things and explore them, and then they get thrown out. These are totally like, actually, I'm looking at them now, I'm like, oh man, it's really sad. They're just never going to be used. But ultimately, what we ended up doing was scrapping that and going back to the drawing board when I think we stopped for about a month. I left Riot internally, and I started doing contract work because I was getting so much work offered to me. And I was like, I'm just going to start an art house. I'm going to train up some other artists, and we're going to develop art for World of Warcraft, for Overwatch, and for League of Legends, and for Legends of Runeterra, because I was just spread too thin. And that was a great decision from a business standpoint, but I still wanted to work on a lot of these faction crests. So from a contract standpoint, I continued to work with them. And what we did was we started out with Demacia, and what we had was this. When we started designing for Demacia, what we had was this symbol. This was something that they had somebody else internally that designed this. And I think it was originally like based on some of the sketches that I had done with the sword style. It's like the same style of sword. But they were like, all right, like, what do you got with this? You know, so I started, set out to just do these like highly rendered things because I didn't want to go back to like that sketch phase. I didn't want to do it. And ultimately that bit us in the ass because you can see at first glance, all of these really kind of look the same. But when you get in close, you really see the differences. This one has these like helmet symbols on the side, and that's very reminiscent of what, you know, they ended up seeing in some of the architecture that you see when you look at anybody from Demacia, any of the characters in the lineup of League of Legends heroes. If they're from Demacia, they have some of this, like the colors, the materials, or these symbols that we use as we were creating the sketches for this. And then we decided to take it back a little bit to the drawing board, go back to doing a little bit less of the bright, colorful stuff, get a little bit more into this almost porcelain or like white chiseled stone. This almost looks like it's 3D rendered. This was not done by me, by the way. That was something that another artist internally, you know, saw the designs I was doing, and they started, doing something a little bit more that looked almost 3D modeled. And in fact, look, it is. Look, it was a 3D model suggestion. So some artists are just really fast with 3D, so they're just like, hey, here's my idea in 3D. And so I started riffing off of that, and that's what you got with a lot of these sketches here. And Demacia was definitely the first one that we wanted to tackle because some of the main characters are from Demacia. We tried different statue designs and influences, and you see so many of these explorations through here. Some of these are not me. So there was other artists that were like working, we were ping-ponging off of that. And then we ultimately settled on these colors. So this is something that they would send to me after we've done those initial explorations. And we would get to the point where we can define, well, here's the colors and here's the proportional representation of those colors. So we wanted to go a lot more of that like porcelain or white stone. And then, you know, very little of that gold hits, right? So just tone down those gold hits to these smaller spaces. And that's exactly what you see in this mock-up right here. And so these may seem to the untrained eye or to the outside observer like minuscule decisions, but they shape so much of what, when they're looking at designing a new hero or a skin for a hero that's supposed to fit into the Demacia faction, they need to be thinking about these color relationships. Sometimes color can be such a defining factor for your faction. You know, when we think about Horde or Alliance, it's like there's very distinct colors that come to mind when you think about those two factions. And the same is true. We wanted to make sure that the same was true for the factions of League of Legends. So you might be thinking, well, okay, it looks like you guys really honed in on something there. Maybe you could progress to a final render now. Nope. We wanted to try different angled stuff. You can see these kind of shapes. These are going to define the architecture. These are going to define these shapes. These kind of, would the cities of Demacia and the buildings in the city of Demacia, would they have these kind of curves, for example? And so much of the shape language that you define in your crest can say so much about the character and what they believe. So if these guys, if we're to just look at the crest, we could ascertain that these guys think that they are holy. They think that they're in some way on some spiritual quest. They think that they're regal, you know, they think that they're opulent. There's a lot of just decorative elements. You wouldn't have that in, like, say, a savage orc crest, for example. It's not going to be elegant. It's not going to be refined. It's not going to look manufactured. It's not going to look like there's intricate symbology woven in between the cracks of things. And all those things are establishing shape language and level of detail and cultural implications throughout. And you'll see that impacting so many more of these designs as we go through them. Here we have a little bit more explorations, refining that design a little bit. At this point, we're like, let's just stop rendering color into things and just focus on like the design. We know what the colors are going to be. So I did this series of more explorations of implementing different types of shields. And this was just day in and day out. You might see something like this. I do maybe 2 pages of something like this in a day. And that's about the amount of work that I would do on something like this. And, you know, in between doing concept art for, like I said, some of the locations in Summoner's Rift. So it was a lot of dancing back and forth and getting feedback from other artists that would be working on the same designs a little bit, and basically every time you touch it, you're just bringing the ball a little bit forward, and then somebody else somebody else can pick up the ball and like carry it just a couple of yards. And sometimes you get knocked back and you realize, well, none of that worked. So we're going back to the drawing board on some things, but let's go back to a point where we were onto something. At this point, we were honing in on the design. We were so sure this is the one. This is exactly the final design. And then we need to separate out the parts so that we can animate, for example, if we wanted to have little sparkles or glows behind things, those parts need to be separated out. So this is like a Photoshop file, as we were also defining what kind of a material is that. Maybe we want to reduce the gold in there just a little bit as well. And so this, just softening the rendering. And I actually learned, I want to tell you this, if you're doing crests, you're going to learn so much about material rendering, because that's a lot of what the job is. It's like getting a very clear indicator of the type of material, how reflective it is, how matte a surface can be. I would say that if you ever looked at any of my art and thought, that guy can draw some materials, it's because I spent literally like 2 years doing crests for League of Legends. And here you can see another variation where we just we're still exploring that like shape of the background. And even at this point, I was like, here's the thing. This kind of work could drive a lot of artists mad. Like you turn something in, they take it apart. You turn it in, they take it apart. They turn it in, they take it apart. You don't want to be somebody that complains when you're doing this sort of a thing. So I was trying to nudge them into, like, I already knew this is super inefficient, but I was also paid hourly. Because like I said, I went contract and my hourly pay was good. Like this gig did good for me. And true, I was at that time hiring assistants. I started to realize it's okay. It's okay. Don't tell them they're wrong. Maybe nudge them to be more efficient, but maybe bring in an assistant to help with some of the material rendering and iterations. And that's exactly what I did. It was actually the best business decision I could have made. At this time, Riot was pretty flush with cash. So they were willing to just pay for more exploration and iteration, because they were literally pulling in something like, I don't know what it was, $10 million a day, something absurdly ridiculous. League of Legends was like the most profitable game in the world for a chunk of time. And I think there's still more. There were still more Demacia crests. These are some older ones that got rejected. Here's some more that got rejected. This is going to be a long video if I go through every single design, because my goodness. Look, here's an example of some feedback that we got at one point where they actually showed me some, references to knight armor. I think this is from World of Warcraft, actually. Yeah, look, that's an alliance shield. Also, we're mostly just looking at materials when we're looking at that. Like, how do the folds of things fit together? Like, can we incorporate that into the design? We might have even seen like the shape language of this was a structure that they were developing simultaneously in the visual development department. And then you also have this percentage. Look at this. This is really interesting stuff here. This is stuff that nobody thinks about or talks about. Is this glamorous? No. Is this YouTube worthy? I don't know. Like probably like 1% of people, not even 1% of people who are interested in League of Legends would be interested in this, let alone people who are interested in concept art or designing for video games. No, there's so much of this is just like gets looked over, but this is the kind of stuff that you go to college to learn. This is the kind of stuff you go to art school to learn. This is the kind of stuff I teach in my workshops for a fraction of the price of art school, by the way. Anyway, so there's so many of these subtleties of material definition and why is it, these amounts of color? Because every color has a kind of an emotion. For example, colors like red and yellow. There's a reason why McDonald's uses red and yellow. It makes you hungry. Scientifically proven. Psychologists can all verify. If you're a psychologist and you disagree with this, show me the research where it's not true. But colors, you learn this in graphic design. Certain colors create a certain mood or energy. In the same way that sounds can create mood and energy. So there's a reason why in Resident Evil, when you go into a save room, the music is this beautiful, serene, water flowing kind of because as soon as you step out the door, it's like monsters screaming at you and wanting to tear your jugular out. And so the colors, the sounds, all those factors really play into the mood and energy of what you're trying to convey to the player. This is a big part of the psychology of game design. It's something we accommodate for in the Twilight Monk game that I'm developing right now with my indie game studio. In every zone, there's a reason for the colors that we chose. Along the way, as we're developing these crests, I started doing these pages that would show us the relationship between the existing crests as they were at that time. And this is important because you do the same thing when you're doing a lineup of heroes or a lineup of characters from a game. You don't want for players or viewers, the same is true for a TV show or an animation, you don't want the viewer to confuse, oh, is that the blonde girl with the glasses that's really skinny? Like, there's 3 of those. And then, you want to make sure that each of your characters, and these crests are characters, you want to make sure that each of them has such a unique distinction between the lineup of the rest of the others. And this is why it's so important that as you hone in on a design and you're like, yes, that's really close to the final, you still got that shot to like go back and go, maybe that is a little too much like something else. So as we were developing like these top 5 main factions, we would every now and then just throw them into the lineup to see like, how are these shaping up literally next to the other crests that we've designed? And do we want to add any elements that maybe make it more distinct? For example, like as visual development department was defining more of the architecture for Noxus, we started going in and rethinking some of these things. Like, do we want to have these cool, like parallel spires, that would look like Mount Doom kind of style, from Lord of the Rings, kind of walls, that would create a little bit more of a consistency with their architecture. And that is ultimately what we ended up doing. And it came from looking at them in the lineup. There's still always that chance to like, if before it's deployed, you can still go back and change those things because it's not yet released to the public. I mean, to be clear, all of this is now 10 years old. It's like all this is history now. But it gave us a chance to go back and rethink our Noxus design. And we ended up really subduing a lot of those colors and going back into something that's more heavy metal, axe shaped, less bright saturated color, bringing it into like a richness and a kind of a grit to it, and that was, I think, a good move, but we had to be consistent about it. Otherwise it would feel like the crests are cartoony and just not fitting with the rest of the universe. Here you can see a distinct difference between the two. So this was, I don't know the exact dates, but like this was where we were pretty sure that was going to be where we were going to go with Noxus. And certainly the colors are consistent with some of the characters from Noxus, but this one ultimately just felt more weighty, meaty, heavier, and bloodied and vicious, really. And that is more of what Noxus is about. But we weren't done yet. More explorations, more blood splatters, bringing out just a little bit more saturation. I might do something like this in 20 minutes and then send it over. Well, there's actually more detail than what you see, because when you really dig into it, it's like, I'm always digging into different material rendering styles and like different brushes. And I really refined my custom brush set. Same brush set that I sell is the same one I use. And I defined that. I really created that during this time to get these like kind of noisy metals through here. That's like a kind of a brush, blending brush that I use. And a lot of this kind of stuff, you can still see, ooh, there's a little bit of an error there where I cut and pasted. It would have gotten cleaned up by the final anyway. And it's okay to be a little sloppy before you really define the final version. The PSD that I usually label final is the final. But look at this, like such subtleties. But would people really notice this? Look at that one versus this one. Do you really see the difference there? Let me put them side by side there. Do you see the difference? It's very subtle, but it's there. You can see these like slight engravings. This might have been, I think this was some feedback from another artist, possibly Sam, the artist that I was working in direct correlation with, who was in-house and I was like working remotely. I used to just travel around. I spent a month in Thailand. I spent a month or about a month every year in Hawaii at the time, like just traveling all over the place. And I just work off of a laptop and do these iterations, send them in every day, and then I'd get feedback the next day. And that was like a beautiful thing. That was my process. I loved that level of freedom. I never wanted to go like necessarily management, but things happen. Anyway, this sort of a thing right here, look at this, where we were trying out maybe a little bit more of a Boba Fett, like stern kind of a helmet design, maybe just a little less of just like evil eyes, just trying different things, there's different stuff. Here we see that lineup again of all of them next to each other from Freljord, Ionia, Shurima, Bilgewater, Shadow Isles, Piltover, Noxus, Demacia. Oh, what are these guys called? Zaun. That's what they're called. So you might be thinking, oh, so this must be like how you sketch out. This is the first sketch that you should do for something like Zaun, right? No. Back it up a step. Because Zaun came from the same process, probably one of the most meticulous processes. So let's dig into it. This is where Zaun begins. So we have these really cool drawings by Mark Gibbons, whom you might know from his, he's sort of very well known from his work on Games Workshop stuff and Blizzard stuff, and good guy. Known him for a long time. Really interesting designs. He would just do these kind of designs. And so we wanted to encapsulate a lot of the personality he had infused into the character designs and some of the architecture for for Zaun. And so we would begin with this shape, like defining that. And then we would look at something like, well, what are some iterative sort of sketches that encapsulate those same ideas? You've got these sort of bulbs of energy, like green energy. You can see this almost syringe looking thing. Very sharp designs coming throughout. So a lot of designing a crest, for example, like this, comes from, in many ways, being informed by what other artists are doing with the culture kits and the faction kits and the architecture and the character designs that are coming from that faction, and infusing that into something like this. But you want a central element. And this is something to point out. Like, you'll notice that across all of these, there is some consistency, right? It's like the central element that was, and this is why, like we talked about coming up with that symbol early on, right? That symbol for what Zaun is this sort of City of Lost Children kind of a vibe, right? Like, so this symbol needs to be consistent across all of our sketches, and all of our explorations have the same familiar element that we're sure of when we defined that symbol. And that symbol had the breadth and the shape language and the sort of embodied so much of the concepts of what that faction is into one symbol. And that's why we had to do like hundreds of them, early on. But then you want to iterate and play around within that new space, right? So we would kind of like get some feedback on that and go, we really like these cool wings. So like those are going to stick. And you'll notice like in this next round, all of those stick. And by the way, notice this, I always letter every one of my iterations. And the reason for that is when you're in the meeting and you're talking with the client, you can go, I really like maybe the spikes from K, like, looking at these, I really like the spikes from K. I can make a note and go, keep the spikes from K, version K on this specific one that was done on March 23rd, 2015. Like all of this stuff ties into keeping the iterations organized, keeping it clear so that if anybody says, well, why did we lose that cool handle on the top from L in that, these Zaun crest designs back then in 2015? I can point to the feedback and say, well, this is where you told me you didn't want that specific element, And so it's important for helping to facilitate communication and keeping everybody on the same page and making sure that you're not getting lost in the millions of iterations that are going on. So make sure that you keep clear track of something like that. Otherwise, you end up just with like trying to describe it and like try to describe, E versus F amidst all of the iterations you just saw. Try to describe that distinction. Okay, I guess this is the one with a clock on it, or the pressure gauge. Okay, you could say that, yeah, okay, they are distinct enough, but there's so many consistencies, or they're so similar that it would be really hard to really identify like what makes that different without using a lettering system or using some other distinctions. Now, the other trick is you don't want to just like go, you know what, like here's an iteration. That's not moving the needle, man, at all. You're not moving the needle. You need to make each iteration have a distinctly unique element that's tertiary. By that, I mean, it's not the primary element. We know the symbol. I'm going to switch back to red here. The symbol in the center is the primary element. The secondary elements are pressure gauges, little bottles, we're still looking a little bit for those secondary and tertiary elements. Secondary and tertiary elements are smaller in the pie. Like if you were to make a pie of what the elements of this design are, any design, this isn't just for Zaun, this isn't just for these crests. This is true with character design too. Designing crests can teach you so much about character design. You want your central element of what is the most immediately distinct and identifiable element of that character. When we look at Cloud Strife from Final Fantasy VII, what are his distinct elements? If you shave his head or change his haircut from that spiky haircut and get rid of his Buster Sword, he ain't Cloud anymore. You lose the core primary element of what he is. Now, what are his secondary elements? The colors. The colors are kind of a secondary element, but they're consistent. The percentage of color, how much blue versus how much skin is showing, right? You change the color of his hair, he ain't Cloud anymore. He's Zack. You saw that coming probably, because they're the same guy. Pretty much personalities are different. But anyway, so it's important to think of your elements like a pie chart, okay? So when you're designing a character, when you're designing a crest, what are your primary elements and what are the colors that really make up who that character is and what are the percentages of colors? Create pie charts. You saw some of the examples of that and you'll see more of them as I'm showing you more of these crests. But that percentage of the amount of color that you're using in a character design or in a crest is going to help also make that really identifiable with that faction. And so while we're doing these, we're like looking for what are some new secondary or tertiary elements that would not be as prominent. This takes up the majority of the space. And when I'm talking about a pie chart, I literally mean like, you know, how much of, is it 80% of it is this? You know, that central element? And then like, you don't want this to be even. You don't want your secondary and tertiary elements to be even. You don't want just as much of that real estate to be the wings as you do with a bulb. No, you want an offset. So it's like 3, 2, 1 in priority, right? And this is also, this goes into the golden ratio, right? This is like a sort of a hierarchy of clustering. And I do this even when I'm doing things like, when I'm clustering rocks, I don't cluster rocks the same size next to each other like this. No, when I'm clustering rocks in a painting, I'm going primary, secondary, tertiary. And that's so much more interesting to look at than this. So you want to be thinking that with your design of your primary element is the big honkin' rock in the middle. You've got some medium-sized rocks around that are maybe a different color and different like shape. And then you've got your little bits in betweens and the little dancing stuff that peppers around it to add the detail. If you're thinking this way with color, you're thinking this way with shape, you're thinking this way with the concept itself, then your ideas will resonate more because you're not saying too much. This is true with YouTube videos too. And this is why this won't be like a popular video. There might be cool people like that are way into design and want to improve their work. But like, there's a lot of information in a video like this, as opposed to a 60-second video that's all about, one idea, just one idea from this whole breadth of this video, which would be more popular. And I should probably be breaking apart my videos into like shorts to do that. A more like focused idea. And you might notice this if you're really paying attention to it. Ask yourself that question. When you listen to like a long form podcast, there might be 100 takeaways, but you know, the ones you remember are the ones that are to the point. It's like, oh, that's what so-and-so said about, you know, space travel. Okay, that's a random idea. But my point is, too much information clouds the idea. It makes it hard to focus. And especially when people have short attention spans, you want to create something memorable, keep it focused, keep it simple, keep it short, and pepper it with secondary and tertiary details that aren't as important to the main focus of what that character is. And make sure that the primary idea of what it is really strongly represents what you're trying to say about that faction or about that character. Here's where you really see it here, where we went primary focus is this cool bubble needle thing with the syringe style spiked wings coming off of the side. Totally secondary is these like pumps, right? This is not rendered by me. I think I did end up doing the final one, but I went back and forth with another artist on a lot of these Zaun designs, but because at this point we were pretty much, it was already kind of like halfway locked in by the time I got to it. This one I rendered a lot on. But again, you know, what ended up happening is the whole shape of things, and I haven't really talked much about this, but we thought about that a lot as we were doing the lineup as well as like, so when we go back and we look at the full lineup, right, we've got some distinct shapes going on here where like Freljord is very clearly triangular, right? Ionia, very much like a circular spiral, right? Shurima, very much like, sure, a triangle, but with the big circle on top, right? So because we were getting into some more complex stuff. Bilgewater definitely has like this cauldron style shape, right? Shadow Isles, very much like a plaque. And if you really look at it, every one of these has such, Piltover just kind of looks like a big circle. And we were really concerned by the way, so similar to the shape of Ionia. And I think that's why it was so important this had more of a swirl shape to it with a central fire element to make it distinct, because ultimately Piltover is a little bit more of like this kind of almost an anchor shape, right? Demacia definitely has like emphasis on the wings, blade coming up. So we were digging into making sure that the lineup itself had distinct overall shape to it. And this one was starting to look too much like an upside down triangle and not enough like its own thing. So we ended up ditching those. We took them pretty far too. We made it oblong and lopsided because, you know, that's the interesting thing about Zaun is that they are a little lopsided. They're lopsided in that universe. They're not the uniform consistency that every other, like Demacia, very orderly, structured, symmetrical. Zaun, out there, weirdos. Like, if you're a Zaun fan, I'm not calling you a weirdo. I'm saying the faction is meant to be like, this is the Borg type of dudes, you know? They're the guys that have like the big cyborg eye and the, you know, like big, you know, robotic limbs and things like that. And so we wanted to like really represent that in the faction as well, is that they're not orderly and straight and uniform like every other culture and every other faction. Man, so many explorations for Zaun. This was one of the latter ones that we did too. And sometimes when we would sort of like, we would spend a lot of time just doing rendering, and that was really burning a lot of our resources. So we ended up like kind of really taking a step back and going to black and white again at different points. And you'll notice like these secondary containers, like a secondary heart, you know, like there was some thinking like that going into these designs. This was like taking it back to the core. These might have been the first sketches that we did before we got to some of those more highly rendered ones. And you can see how these were still symmetrical and still uniform. And by the way, one thing I want to show you, if you're using Photoshop, every painting program has something like this, but I use this so much as this symmetry tool up here. And it's just this little butterfly looking thing. And if you put that on and then you draw a line perfectly down, then anytime you're making like a line, it'll mirror it. So if you're like rendering over here, this is kind of cool. I'll just show you like really briefly, but like if you're rendering over here, I've shown this off so many times. I feel like it's the oldest party trick in the book. It's like your uncle that keeps pulling quarters out of your ear, you know, and you're 20 years old. And it's like, come on, dude, I'm so sick of you stop pulling quarters out of my ear. Well, stop using the symmetry tool like it's new, Trent. Well, I do that a lot, but because for some people, this is your first time you're ever seeing this thing. And it's like, what? I only have to draw it once? Yeah, and it mirrors it, which is pretty useful, especially if you're doing something like a crest. I had to mention that because somebody out there is going to be like super ambitious, and I totally admire you if you've got your sketchbook open right now and you've been sketching out some crests while I'm talking crests. Or if you're applying some of what I'm talking to your concept art, like check out that symmetry tool. Here's some of the kind of example of feedback I'd get. Hey dude, here's some images I showed today. I used your designs as a base, but just did a bit of value. This is what I would get from them, from Sam, likely, whom I was working with a lot. And he would just take my sketches and like go, hey, a little bit more like this, a little bit more like that. And now sometimes, here's the thing. Another reason to go black and white halfway through your iteration of your design is that you don't want to be distracted by color. Color is so powerful. Color is like when you're eating something and somebody comes in with like totally different smell and it just dominates what you're eating, right? So you have to be mindful of like sometimes when you're looking for a design of something, just bump it down to black and white. Yeah, like if you're to look at this, here's a quick way. Just hit Command U and then slide that saturation all the way down. And you can assess like what's popping. Because contrast is another way to make something pop or not pop, right? And what's the standout here? Like what's working, what's not working, minus the color. Because sometimes the color can just really like trick the viewer into thinking that this is something like a better design than it is. But then when you're looking at it, it's not memorable because the color was sort of like that overpowering smell, that spice that just takes over the flavor of the whole thing. And that can actually like dilute the importance of the design itself. And again, like this is an example of what I was talking before about how much I grew as a renderer, right? Like I feel like some of this stuff was some of the best rendering I had done. I was just digging into so many brushes and we never knew where we were at. We never knew like how close we were to like sort of getting final approval. I always hoped after like every single time I'd finish another crest design, I always thought, well, the next one will go smoother. And then Sam would agree, yeah, the next one will go smoother. No. It's a few more of these Zaun designs. This is where they actually like modeled it out. One of the artists was like, well, does that work in 3D? This is pretty cool to see, right? I don't think you can see that anywhere else online. I wish I had more of this sort of behind the scenes stuff, as I was designing a lot of this stuff. We had to take the jar out because Riot Games will a lot of times they'll spine things up, and there's a program called Spine that'll basically help you to animate 2D stuff, or sometimes After Effects. You can do the same thing. You can have like particles coming out and waves in the water, and I'm sure that somewhere online they've done this. You could probably look it up. So Targon was one of my favorite. I worked with Eric Canetti, who was the project manager on that. We started out with a lot of these. If you know Eric Canetti, he's an incredible comic book artist, animation designer, and a hell of a guy, and just hardworking ethics. One of my favorite people to talk to, and just to see his work is amazing. But he got wrapped up. A lot of the artists there would sometimes get wrapped up into having to manage outsource artists, or they'd get put on like attacking a problem. In this case, we were like trying to define what is the Targon, Mount Targon stuff look like for the crest. And so we started out with like, he had some character designs that he sent me that he had done. And so I was trying to find consistencies. We knew the symbol was that mountain with the sort of like a shattered moon looking thing going on around it. Super sci-fi and very different, like in terms of its shape, language, and tone. I think this is number 6. Let me go back to like Targon sketches number 2. Here we go. These were the first ones that I had done. Some of these, again, I can't show you everything because it's like, there's so much. We're already going like, this is a long video. But you can see like, there's some neat explorations here. We wanted it to be oblong. We knew that. We wanted it to be reminiscent of something celestial. There's these like kind of space dragons, basically, is what we were going, like space dragons. And one of my favorite color palettes and probably one of my favorite crests to design. And I wanted to do this one personally. So I was very involved in these early sketches. And then you go into Targon 2. This was like, refining that. And like we picked a few of them and we're like, oh, let's play around a little bit more with that guy. I think that was based on like this one, really neat, different, very different than the rest of the lineup, right? And then ultimately, like they had this unique kind of a weird stone and we wanted that, but then it was too fragmented. And then something like that doesn't read as quickly as the symbol of something like this, but this looks too refined and it looks too chiseled and like they wouldn't have that necessarily, they're more organic than that. So, we started, here's some feedback. See, really love the simple graphic read of V, as well as the central 3D pinwheel device on A4. So like you could look up, this was A4. Where's A4? Now here we go, A4, right? Like you could look up and see like how they're referring to different feedback. And one thing that I'd also recommend if you're working with a client, this is true with character design as well, I will put their feedback right on my Photoshop file. The reason for that is because I don't want to miss anything. When they are like, as I'm doing this, I'm going back and I'm going, okay, so this one, make a note of it, and then do like my handful of iterations, and then I can checkbox it off. Like that part is done, okay? You know, A variations of a graphic back plate in the style of V, you know, like style of, yeah, there we go. Like the style of V, right? So you might checkbox things off from literally the text that's in your Photoshop file that is the feedback that they've given you directly from your client. As we're becoming more and more certain of like what we're trying to do with this particular crest, you know, we're sort of like going through, and a lot of times we'll just like go, no, not that one. I get these like kind of sketch overs from Eric Canetti about, you know, wow, maybe a little bit more of this kind of a thing. And he's riffing off of some of the ones that I had done. And then we kind of like honed in on, well, let's see how these look in color, because maybe they'll have a little bit more impact in color. And it definitely embodies this sort of celestial feel. Some of these were just so cool. Like, look at this. Oh, the cloth wrapped up in there, but way too complicated. This is just monotone, too monotone. This obviously loses the symbol of the mountain right here, and it is Mount Targon. Kind of important to have that. This was feeling a little too much like Zaun with its shape language, right? So like that's out, you know. This one wasn't bad. I think this one really had a lot of impact, and we ended up kind of going, we did a lot of explorations in this sort of a vein. And so if we skip ahead, so that's iteration sheet number 17. So if you can imagine it, something like this would be about a day's worth of work. You know, for those of you that are wondering, about a day's worth of work to do this many iterations off of, you know, riffing off of previous designs based on feedback. We backed off the purple a lot because here's the thing, when we look at the rest of the lineup, those are way too saturated. We needed to tone that down, like way down. So we went with a little bit more like, get back to the original, like just the logo. What if you were to like just take out all that fluff and just keep it the logo, right? Because we're sure of that. We were sure of the logo. Keep that. And start cutting out, trimming away, and then go, okay, let's get back to that circular. Look at this. This was really cool and very close to the final design. You know, and in fact, I think some of these are better than what we chose. Like, I would have gone with this one. Boom. That's your design for Mount Targon. Little lens to the universe in the background. Very prominent, you know, mountains in the foreground, scratched up, but not symmetrical because they're not totally uniform. They're a little chaotic, right? Not crystalline, you know, keeping the main logo gold. Yeah. Oh, this one's good too. I love that one. Kind of techie though, and this doesn't really match. They got rivets in there. That's not the Targon style. So let's bump it up. What happened the next day? Oh, really trying some out there stuff. And in fact, ooh, mama, look at that one. Oh, I love that. This reminds me of like when I was designing the Exodus for Burning Crusade, right? I tried to incorporate star charts into their architecture. So getting that into the Targon stuff was like, oh yeah, what a nice fit. This almost like tribal, chaotic view of star charts, you know, worked into the stonework and worked into, I don't know if this is metal or stone. It kind of looks like a combination of both. It looks like an alien material, but then this is kind of weird. Like, what is that? Looks like a jaw of a robot, right? Does not compute. This one's cool too. And then ultimately, like these, we started to really tune into something. You can really see, what I love about showing these is like, you can really see how much this started to really take a shape of, you know, exactly like what the final design would be. And it was really evolving. Okay, I took this one back after that point and I started riffing off of some of those designs. Like what about like some interesting, crazy, like crown looking things coming off at the top? And what about like, you know, so like adding a new element that we haven't tried before? Like Riot was still very open to this sort of exploration, even at this phase, because like I said, this is probably 2 months into designing, or a month and a half into designing for Targon. And we're still looking for the design. We're still looking for like, what could it still be? Like, you know, and then something happened here where they went, that plate, like having that plate behind it really sells it, but it loses the stone, organic, earthy feel that we want. So we brought that back into, I think, maybe not this sheet, the next sheet. Yeah. Asymmetry. Getting into some asymmetry. And so you can see here where this is now a couple of months later. By 2016, we're still working on crests, dude. If you remember, the first one was 2013. So that's 3 years of designing crests. It's not all I did, because like I said, I was also working on a lot of stuff for Summoner's Rift. I was working on a lot of stuff for Legends of Runeterra. I was working on a lot of stuff for Overwatch at this time. But I had expanded the team out, so I was able to just do a lot more. I might like sketch out like 2 of these or 3 of these and then give it to my assistant to explore like 1 or 2 more variations. But you'll notice like we're not doing the big sheets full of explorations anymore. By this point, we're really like honing in on this asymmetry of things. It's still capturing this like clean, almost like tribal view of celestial bodies. Like we still kept a lot of that, but playing in a lot more of the organics of the stone. This is what I was talking about before, you know. And by this one, we're really close. So I don't even have the final somewhere. It's buried somewhere in my computer, but because by this point we were just doing so many of them. But this was the ultimately like the final design of what it turned out to look like. And, you know, it kept a lot of the original, but ultimately, you know, the symbol in the middle, but it's ultimately like not my favorite one. I don't know why necessarily they chose this one. Ultimately, I do think that some of the previous crest designs were better, but it's ultimately never really the artist's decision. It's something that the team decides on, the art director or the game director decides on, and you know, you just have to like not be too attached to any one of them, generate more of them, and then move on. So because my recording shows that I'm at an hour long now, so I am going to start zipping a little bit faster through a lot of this stuff. There's still so much more to show. I thought, well, maybe I'll just show you the Freljord crest. So this was pretty close to the final design for it, but like, look at these subtle differences. Look. And then look at the difference. If you can even spot it, it's in the shapes that are represented in the metal. And then also kind of this inward kind of, let me use like an orange here so you can see. But there's these sort of like inward movement lines, you know, and then the icicles, this whole symbol is like kind of worked into a bunch of ice. And then like this doesn't have that, see? So that was subtlety, but like, it's important. You know, got to try all this stuff. And then also the symbols on these sort of like Nordic runes, you know, that you see up here. Different designs throughout that one. Subtle, but most people would never notice. But like, that's there. And look, these are the kind of notes I would get. Yeah, more like this shape, not like this shape. Yeah, more like that, not like that. There's a couple more. Yeah, this is the final crest. So this was... I actually think like maybe this is like a better version than what we ended up doing for the final. Like the final has like, it's a little overcomplicated. And in my opinion, probably like not the strongest of all of them. So some people are pretty big fans of faction crests that I'm just not going to be able to cover or show because my goodness, I have like mountains of content like this, like just piles and piles of folders full of these sketches. But like when we started doing a crest, this was the beginning of the Piltover crest. And I wanted to show this off, like you can see like the process. So I started out with this kind of like clockwork design. I remember distinctly doing these designs. I think I even like photo bashed some actual clock gears behind there just to like get the idea down. And again, you remember earlier I was talking about that immediate read of the shape. So I was thinking about that when I did this one and I thought, well, it would be cool to do like a giant X kind of a shape for this one, you know, and just refining it a little bit. I won't say too much about that. Looking for that overarching shape. Some of these were cool because they kind of looked a little Art Deco, right? A little bit like, you know, 1940s or 50s, kind of like maybe 30s to 40s, like right after, yeah, like this kind of like Empire State Building sort of shapes going on. Look at this right here. And then this is just exploring the frame around it. We were sure though that we wanted to use the gear shape to frame the whole thing, but we weren't sure about those secondary elements. So we were still exploring a little bit. And yeah, 20 20 sheets. Like I'd do a whole day of just this. Yeah. Yeah. More and more. Oh, and then we started to, you can definitely see where we're like, yes, okay. So these sort of represent like those buildings, those like, you get like the Empire State Building shapes going on in there. And we were sure about some of these elements, like around, well, the framing certainly of the central element, the symbol in the middle, playing out throughout the whole design, getting a little bit of color in there. You can see I started like pulling in some character images. How much of that is looking like the characters that are from Piltover, for example. What's her name? Vi, I think. And then here we're really like, okay, let's nail it down. Let's get into some like stained glass windows. Let's get into some like, colors and dark materials and get some like nice lighting in there. You'll notice there's a radial lighting coming out from the center that pulls your attention a little bit more towards the center, so that your eye goes to the symbol. That's what we wanted to do with that one. And let's keep going here. You can see like this is how it might look from the side, because at this point was when we were starting to play around with like, well, every one of these should look like it could be modeled in 3D, right? And that wasn't something we were thinking about early on. This is closer to the final where we were looking at like what's the balance of things, like how much of this is like approved at this point and how much are we still looking for, right? And so like this is something that Sam put together for me to like show me, it's like we're really close to the final on that. Still refining the smallest little details. Look at this. How many of you would have the patience for this? Like, let me know in the comments below if you think this is madness. Would you go nuts doing this sort of a thing? Because this is not something you do at an indie game studio. You don't spend that much time doing a faction crest at an indie game studio. You don't have the budget. But Riot Games at this time was the biggest video game company in the world. Imagine Fortnite money, right? They had more than that, okay? They were numero uno. It was Fortnite before Fortnite, right? So it doesn't play the same. I'm not saying that. I'm saying like the level of success you can imagine. I don't know what the biggest game in the world is right now, but like League of Legends was it. And so they just had money. I don't want to say money to burn, but like they had money to burn. I don't want to dig in. I could probably do a lot longer video, but it's pretty meaty. If you've listened to the whole video to this length at this point, man, you're an ace. I got to tell you that. I'd love to hear your thoughts about all this stuff. I'd love to know, like, do you think you could like do this kind of work? Is it something that you'd have the patience for? Some artists wouldn't have the patience to keep trying even after you've done something that you're so sure is like, this would have been the design that I would have approved. And like, but you're still working on it for another 2 months, possibly. For League of Legends, as you saw from the dates on those files, I worked on them for about 4 years. And I did all the ones that were in the game, except for one that I was barely involved in. And I did a ton of other stuff for League of Legends, but I don't know if I even have the patience for it anymore. I don't know that I could do it. I don't know that I could do it for all the money in the world, because it was fun because I could kind of tune out and just explore and not feel any like, oh, this had to be right or perfect or anything like that. And I could travel from anywhere in the world and do this. I could literally work on this on the plane because it's not anatomy. It's not, getting the lighting just right. It's not about the perfecting of the rendering. It was about the design. It was about the meaning behind the design. And it was about defining a culture kit and defining a shape language and defining colors and the logic and the rationale behind what makes good design. And that was so valuable for me. And I would recommend it to anyone. Like if you're building your own universe, build factions, build crests for those factions, and start out using the same process that you saw me do in this video. Define like a symbol that represents them, define like materials and the kind of shapes that would represent what their beliefs are, like that'll force you to also think about, what do they believe? Why would this even be a faction separate from another faction? Maybe it's just corporations. Maybe it's just a group of people, an insurgent group or something, or a resistance or, rebels and empire, like what are those factions? Great IPs have good factions, and good stories come from idealistic conflict, I'd say. The really good ideas come from that. That's been true since the beginning of time of recorded history, ever since biblical times even, one might say. That would be an interesting experiment, go back through history and try to like retroactively define or create crests for factions of people that maybe they didn't have a flag, they didn't have a symbol. And flags are just crests. They're just super simplified crests. They represent something. When you look at the United States flag, it represents, the original flag was the 13 colonies, represents now all of the states, right? So every nation has symbolism in their meaning of everything. And if you can do that with your IPs and your ideas and your characters, even a character themselves might alone have a flag, and then other people that follow them. Militaire sans frontiers, like in the Diamond Dogs for Metal Gear Solid, for example, they have a crest. It's one of the first things you design because it embodies the whole idea of what makes that group unique. Anyway, please do let me know if you enjoyed this video and what else you'd like to see me talk about here on my YouTube channel. I do want to encourage you to go and check out the Twilight Monk indie game that I'm working on. It's available in February of 2025. It'll be on PC and Nintendo Switch, and you can wishlist it over on Steam right now. And watch some of my other videos for more info on that, or if you're just interested in art and you want to learn better game design or how to make art assets for games. We're doing a lot more videos. Hopefully stuff like this is fun to do. If people like it, I'll do more of it. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and thanks for watching to the end. And don't forget to comment, subscribe, and all that jazz. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks. Bye.